The following story has been brought to you by StoriesToInspire.org.
In Lublin, in the yeshiva of Rameh Shapir, there was a Rosh Yeshiva Reb Shimon Lezelachov. Shimon Lezelachov was a goy in Pella, an Ish Kodosh, remembered Kol HaTorah Kula, Mamish Mila B'Mila. He once told us, Talmid, that by the time he was 18 years old, he was able to say over Shas, word for word, Baal Peh. At 16, he was able to say all of the Sifrei Maral, Baal Peh, word for word. He said, I used to daven to the Rebbeinu Shalom that I should forget something. The Maryatz, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, said he believed that there hadn't been such a Baal Zikaron in Klal Yisrael for the past few hundred years. It boggles the mind. Rav Wachsman remembers, and he said he remembered when he was in the office once, Rameh Shapira, before they took Reb Shimon. So he remembers there was a man from Zelachov, a tall, dignified man, and Rameh Shapira asked him, tell me about this Reb Shimon Zelachov. Rav Wachsman said he was there, and he said he's the Gadol Hador. So he means the Gadol Hador. So I'll tell you what, we all know in Zelachov, Reb Shimon was a very poor man, and one Shabbos he didn't have anything to eat, and he created a chicken with Sefer Yitzir. So Rav said, well, this is what the man said. He says, I don't know. One thing I did see, I saw him saying Sefer Yitzir Mila B'Mila without the Sefer. He was able to say it Baal Peh. Shimon was an Ishpela, Baal Moifis. A few weeks ago, I was in Borough Park for Shabbos. I was at a Kiddush. And somebody comes out to me and says, oh, there's an elderly Yid sitting next to me. He says, you know, this fellow lived in Reb Shimon Lezelachov's house in Kruker during the war. He was in Kruker. Then the Oilam came to him. He used to speak Shalashud. He said, this man slept by him. I said, wow, I want to hear. I mean, how many Yidden are there who remembered Reb Shimon, who had day-to-day contact with him? And he said, I'll tell you, it's very interesting. He says, it was just before the war broke out. He says, this Yid was an Einikl of the Chanchina Rebbe. The Shimon was a Chanchina Chassid, so he had a certain iskabish there. He was in a Belzi yeshiva in Kruk. He came from Soslovitz. And everybody was talking, is there going to be a war? Is there not going to be a war? People want to know, what does Reb Shimon say? Is the war going to break out? So remember, they went, they asked, I was a little young bacher, but they asked Reb Shimon, he said, what are they talking about? There's going to be a war, and it will be the greatest churban since the world was created. Anyway, when the war broke out, I went to ask him, should I go back to Soslovitz? Should I go back to my family? And he said, Vustavs taheim genechod du habet shlufdu. I have a bed here in the house, so sleep here. And that's where I stayed. He says, you remember the first Yom Kippur, so you weren't allowed to go out. The bombardment had just begun. And yet people came. Reb Shimon had in the attic a small little besmedrish, and a minyan got together. A few hours before Kol Nidre, he was pacing back and forth. I went over to him, I asked him, I said, Rebbe, I haven't heard from my parents. I don't know what's going on. I'm hearing all sorts of stories. Are they alive? Are they not alive? He closed his eyes and he said, your father's still alive, your mother's still alive, but don't ask me any more questions. He said, I remember the davening. He said he was the Stamm from Koshner to Chassidim, Reb Shimon. So he used to say all the piyutim, all the long piyutim with the little letters, 5-6 pages, all without a machzeh. He said it all without a machzeh. At the Yom, he said, if I wouldn't have seen it with my own eyes, I wouldn't have believed it. Remember, there was once a Shalosh Shudas, and it was packed. People were standing and they wanted to hear a word from Reb Shimon, and it was illegal to gather together. And suddenly the Oilam started shush giving that the Germans surrounded the building. And they were trying to get Reb Shimon's attention. He was just saying Torah. So he says, I was a bocha, a little bit of a mechutziv. So I went and I took off his shtreimel and I put it on the table so he should stop. So he turned, he looked at me and he said, well, what's this? I said, the Dach, I didn't get him in. He says that they've surrounded the building. He said, we just said the pasuk from the Ma'aseh Sdoim that the people who were surrounding the house were stricken with blindness, and they all went away. So Eden Borough 3 weeks ago told me the story, said he was there. Anyway, I want to get to the point I want to bring out, not just tell Sipurim, it's a Shabbos, of other time to tell stories. So what happened to Reb Shimon in the end? So this Goin Pella, this Tzaddik, this Ish Kodesh, he was snatched off the streets, he was put onto a wagon to be deported. And the Askanim found out about it. It was Yidr Blazer Landa, we were very well connected. He was involved in saving the Belzerufs, and he found out that Reb Shimon was on this wagon. He knew the Gestapo agent. He went over to him and he gave him a gold watch. Said, there's a man here, Reb Shimon Horowitz, take him off. So they took him off. Reb Shimon looks at him and he says, Idusa Gitzail to Vugen. There were two types of wagons. There was one where they had a count of how many they had, and the one they just grabbed people off the streets. It meant that if there was a count, so if they take him off, someone else would have to fill his place. And the officer didn't want to answer. So he said, Idusa Gitzail to Vugen or not? So he was standing there. He says, he didn't want to answer. He said, look at me. Du ret shimale. Meaning, you're playing with fire. You better answer me honestly. Is this a counted wagon? He said, yes, it is. He turned around and he said, B'soich ami unoichi yosheves. And he walked right back into the wagon. Greatness! Godless! We were designed to be great. It didn't have to be just a tzaddik ador, the goin and other. It's Yidua, the Wachsman Rav, in his Hakdama. He brings the story, he was in Auschwitz, and a man, a simple Jew, came to him with a question. His son was just taken. It was a group of boys who would be taken to be gassed. And he knew the officer who was leading them, and he had some American money, and I can bribe him. But I'm afraid if I take out and save my son, another boy will go in his place. Rebbe, am I allowed to do this al pi halacha? And the Wachsman of Reiter said, I can't answer you. It's a shaila of nefoshes. I don't have svarim here. How can I paskin such a shaila in a place? And he says, Rebbe, I have nobody else. You have to paskin the shaila. I cannot paskin such a shaila. He says, Rebbe, if you don't tell me that I'm allowed to do it, that means I'm not allowed to do it. And he didn't answer. And the man let his son go to his death, even though he could have saved him. That's the stuff that we're made out of. Tzelem Elokim, Bonim Lamokoim. We are not Nemolim. Nemolim is an unnatural condition for a Yid. We know what it means to give away. If we think about it, we can tap into ourselves and find reserves of greatness that perhaps Golus has taken away from us, the ability to recognize that we have it. I was 2 Shabbos ago, as my brother-in-law was telling me about his shver. He was a Taira Yid. He was nifter a few years ago. He was in a concentration camp. And they were marching, and they were terribly, they were dying of hunger. There was a certain Rav, a famous Rav. He survived the war. He has children, Talmidei Chachamim, Einikla, a respected family in Klal Yisrael. He saw this Rav was collapsing. He could not continue. So the hunger was unbearable. So in this Reb Shmuel, he had a raw egg. And it's all he had. And he took this raw egg and he put it into the pocket of this Rav. And from that he ate that raw egg, and so this Leben, and it brought him to, and he survived the war. And everybody in his family knew, whenever there was a family simcha, he would tell over the story, how he was nearly dying, and Eliyahu Hanavi came and put an egg in my pocket. And everybody, his children, Einiklich, knew the famous Moifis, that somehow he was near death, and this happened. Because years later he met the Yid. Since they were together, they were reminiscing. He said, remember that march? I remember I put an egg in your pocket. He said, "Di bist Eliyahu Hanavi." You know what it means when you're on your last breath and you have to protect your life, but you know somebody else needs it more, to be able to give that away? That's godless. That's more than godless. That's chayim. That means being alive. That means geula. That means greatness. And even in our own little way, in our own Megushim Dika world, we can rise above our selfishness, our own fears, our own need for self-preservation, our own sometimes cowardly behavior, our own always scurrying back into the hole and escaping, running away from any challenge. Somebody I know was just here for a chasana from Europe, came for a mishpacha chasana. It was on Tuesday, and he had to be back in Europe by Shabbos. He had 2 days, he works in a very high-pressure business, doesn't often take a vacation. And he was here with his wife, so he went to Florida for 2 days before going back to Europe. He has a 2-day vacation, doesn't often get to go on vacation. I'm speaking to him, he says, I met here. Met a bacher, a cousin of his who Nebuch is not doing so well. Ali the Shekindah should always do well. And you know what I mean? His Valgings around Florida with friends here and there. He says, I met this bacher. So what did he do? He has 2 days vacation. He spent almost the entire first day with this bacher trying to find him a job. He went into the koil to try to find him a chavrusa. He spent time with him. He walked around showing him this business, that business. He could easily have said, yeah, I'm here on vacation. Oh, this is an achrai, this is a responsibility. Nice to see you, and disappear. Then he said, oh, do you know who I met in Florida? I have a story to tell. Instead of scurrying back into his hole, he decided to be great. He decided to face the challenge. There's something more important than what I need right now at this moment. And he tapped into the reserves of greatness that we all have. And again and again and again, we have the potential to go beyond our selfishness. A fellow I know, a friend of mine, was then when the time of the volcano eruption and the flights were completely out of whack, and he had to catch a flight, and there was huge crowds waiting to get on, and he wasn't the first in line, but he had a first-class ticket, so he had kedima, he had precedence, and they called out his name, and there was a couple of goyim standing. They watched him walking right past them, and he says, oh no, you know what, he's wearing a yarmulke. Says an opportunity in Mekadosh Shem Shemaim. He says, I'm not going to go before them. These people were here before me. They nearly fainted. They couldn't believe who does such a thing. Who does such a thing? I eat with a couple who wants to be Mekadosh Shem Shemaim. And he says, I have a choice now. I can either be great. In the end, he didn't even miss the flight because the flight was canceled in any case. But this is our natural condition. Greatness, elikus, we have this in us.
Enjoyed this story? Come again. Bring a friend. StoriesToInspire.org